Hello folks, so today I'm going to be testing out a new microphone that I've kindly received as a gift from one of my good friends, so I'm quite excited. I've done a wee couple of small tester videos before this and I think it sounds a lot crisper than what it did when I was recording just straight onto my phone, so hopefully you enjoy. I'm going to read from a book that's about my hometown or the local area round about where I come from. So Heritage Tales from the Water's Edge, and it was a Heritage Lottery funded book produced by Inverclyde Council, which is the region that I live in, Inverclyde. I've not been fighting, by the way, just in case anyone thinks I have. I was trying to move a set of drawers and I accidentally scraped my knuckles and it was bleeding, so just in case you think that. So there's a bunch of good stuff in this book, so I'm going to start with this chapter 6, The Tale of the Seven Stowaways. Chapter 6, The Tale of the Seven Stowaways. On the 7th of April 1868, the wooden ship Arran set sail from Greenock to Quebec with a cargo of coal and oakum under the direction of Captain Robert Watt and First Mate James Kerr. On board were 7 stowaways between the ages of 11 to 22. The poorly clad boys were starved, mistreated and subjected to brutal floggings before being abandoned on the perilous ice floes approximately 20 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, the captain telling them that they would be as well to die on the ice as on the vessel. Meanwhile, word had reached Greenock of the mistreatment of the local lads from a disapproving crew letter, and upon the Arran's return to the closely knit town, the captain and first mate were met at the harbour by an angry mob set on revenge. The captain and first mate were tried shortly afterwards at Edinburgh High Court, where the tale of the 7 stowaways was told by the boys who survived it. 6th of April 1868. Down in Greenock's bustling harbours, 11-year-old Hugh McEwen stood trying to convince fellow 11-year-old John Paul to stow away on the ship Arran. McEwen, whose widowed mother had recently moved to Glasgow, was seeking any ship that was bound for America the next day. He was unaware that the Arran was actually set to transport local coal and oakum to Quebec in Canada, but he knew that the crew were loading up and readying her to leave by the morrow. John Paul, from Dalrymple Street, had never been any further than the tail of the bank. He told McEwen that he would decide by the following day if he would join him in the leaving. However, to his own mind, he was certain that he would stay. The 7th of April 1868, the following day. The next morning, as planned, John Paul met the ever-errant McEwen, who was still steadfast about leaving. McEwen insisted that it was a fair wind, and that if they were to leave on the Arran, they would be clear of the land and tug by night. John Paul didn't know what that meant, and he was fairly certain that McEwen didn't either. He was only 11 after all, and had probably just overheard one of the crew saying something similar on the wharf. Nevertheless, John Paul seemed somewhat convinced by his friend's confidence, and reassured McEwen's notion that they would be back in America in a month. that they would be back from America in a month, just in time for the warm summer. So John Paul decided that he would indeed make for the Arran and leave Greenock behind. The thought wasn't exactly anything out of the ordinary. He had often been on ships with other boys in the harbours, and he knew of places they came and went. Sometimes he cleaned steamers and boilers with his dad, and he would muck about in the rowing boats whenever he could. To his mind, to sail on a ship beyond the tail of the bank and quickly across the Atlantic would be a good fair wind. At their sails was not too terrifying a concept. With a good fair wind at their sails was not too terrifying a concept. Scantily clad, ill-prepared and entirely unaware of the hardships of crossing the Atlantic, the boys crept aboard while the crew were hard at work preparing the ship. They climbed through the forecastle, scuttled through dark corners and hid themselves among the barrels and timber heads. There, crouched in the creaking dark, they met another boy hiding by the oakum, 12-year-old Hugh McGuinness. From their hiding places, the boys watched their town and known world disappear. It was with the slow fade of the familiar shape of the clock lighthouse that the unknown began. We could see the taps of the houses fade our hiding place, and both McEwen and me watched the houses of Greenock disappear and the ship's masts gang out of sight. I began to wish I was at home, but I couldn't get back. In a while we could see some of the houses of Greenock, and we saw the white lighthouse at the clock. After that I didn't ken or see any place that had a minder. The sea soon became rough and the rain harsh as the boys listened to a stranger's voice, belonging to the captain, booming around on the deck. McEwen, Paul and McGuinness came out from their cover and were quickly discovered by the crew, who immediately brought them to the captain. It was only then that the boys discovered that they were not heading for America at all, but Quebec and Canada instead. The cross-examination of the boys was brought to a halt with a commotion from further down the ship. An Irish accent spoke from amongst the coals, and up jumped Barney Riley, 22, an Irish stowaway. Soon after, David Brand, 16, James Bryson, 16, and Peter Curry, 12, came out of their hiding places. None of the 7 stowaways that crept aboard at Greenock had any food with them. Their worldly possessions, the ragged hand-me-downs that hung off them loosely. Some had shoes, others were barefooted. The boys were soon put to work, and it was not long before fatigue and hunger set in. Brisk winds beat their tired bodies and brought hopeless thoughts of home, and for John Paul the idea of sleeping rough on the custom house stairs, something that he had experienced on several occasions, was preferable to his current circumstance. Such were the unforgiving conditions on board Arran. Little did the boys know of the mistreatment and abuse that would follow in the coming days and weeks. I would rather have been sleeping a night upon the custom house stairs at Greenock, though I should have been taken up by a police before the morning. During the first week, the stowaways were given rations the same as the crew members, but as the weeks went by, the rations had reduced to the point where all they received was half a biscuit each day. When one of the boys asked for more food, he was told to eat the snow and ice that covered the deck, and when any of them asked for water, they were set to work, washing decks and performing other menial tasks. As they worked their way across the North Atlantic, provided with next to nothing, the stowaways slept in the cramped conditions of the sail locker while the weather became increasingly stormy and the Arctic chill crept in. The sea and the rain soaked us to the skin, but we had no clothes to change, and we were not allowed near the fire to dry them, but just had to walk about till they were dry, or went to our bed and slept in them. The unforgiving nature of their voyage was only heightened by the much more calculated human evil that they would have to endure throughout the Aran's journey. This ranged from neglect of their basic human needs to the callously cruel abuse handed out to them by some members of the crew, who savagely beat and lashed the boys on multiple occasions. When I sat greeting and starving and trembling with a call in, they would only kick me, and they lashed us with ropes, and they took off clays of some of them to lash them with ropes. They tied some of us hand and feet and then struck us, and I often thought they would kill some of us outright and throw us over the side. The highest ranking members of the ship were apparently the worst offenders: Captain Robert Watt and First Mate James Kerr. Perhaps they saw it as their duty to punish any stowaway that slipped through the cracks and used up the crew's supplies, especially when young James Bryson was caught stealing food repeatedly. However, it would later be revealed that the Aran was adequately stocked with rations that could last for several months. It seemed as though 16-year-old Bryson was the main focus of the abuse. He was repeatedly flogged for minor offences, one time for dirtying his trousers after taking unwell. The line would be about half an inch thick. I ran forward when the mate was flogging me, and the master followed me and made me strip naked. I was then ordered to lie down on the deck. While lying down, one of the men was ordered to go up on the rail and draw water. He drew a bucket full of water and threw it about me. The weather was very cold at the time. It was freezing. The captain scrubbed me while the water was being thrown on me. He scrubbed me with a hard broom. I was lying on my face and back. The captain scrubbed my belly, my back, my chest, my legs. After the master was done, the mate then took the broom without orders from the captain and scrubbed me harder than the captain. After the mate was done, he gave the broom to Brand, one of the boys, and told him to scrub me. Brand took the broom and scrubbed me. While being scrubbed, water was being thrown over me. The flogging stopped when Bryson's back was red raw and bleeding freely. He was then made to stand outside, shivering and naked, in the cold Arctic wind for over half an hour. The stowaways found a rare ounce of kindness in the cook and steward, who snuck food to the boys when they could. This is probably what kept the boys from starving to death on the ship, 1,000 miles from home in the middle of the North Atlantic. To the captain, however, they were not helpless children, but mere ragged burdens. Even 11 years old was old enough for cruel and unsympathetic treatment commonly bestowed upon stowaways. Life meant very little for the poor, the starving and the destitute in 1868, and meant even less for those who secreted themselves aboard ships without consent of the ship's owners, as no record had to be kept of their existence on board. 15th of May 1868. After several weeks of cruelty and neglect, the Aran was close to completing its crossing, but the stowaways would not complete their journey on board. The captain and first mate sent the boys out onto the perilous ice floes some 15 to 20 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, where they were abandoned. The land was not visible from the ship. You could only see the black haze of the land. There are contradicting reports of the events surrounding the boys' reasons for leaving the ship. On one side, reports claimed that the captain told them to walk to the ship Myrtle which was reportedly anchored about 8 miles away, for he was adamant that they would get no food if they remained on board the Arran. When Brand refused to go, the captain caught him by the collar and hauled him to the side of the ship. He did the same to Curry and Paul, and McEwen and McGuinness cried, as they were told, that they might as well die on the ice as in the vessel. Bystanding crew members on board the Arran thought the journey across the cracked ice fields was a near impossible one, although they made no efforts to intervene or to stop the actions of the captain and the first mate. I have been 3 voyages to the Arctic regions, and I considered it a dangerous journey to those not acquainted with ice. The boys were not sufficiently clothed for such a journey. It appeared very unlikely that those who were barefooted would get there alive. The boys were thinly clad and were not able to stand the severe cold. The men could hardly stand it, let alone them. 2 of the little ones had their bare feet. But for the boys, a journey across many miles of cracked ice seemed a more promising option than remaining on the ship, which is perhaps the most damning testament to the captain and the first mate's cruelty. When I left the ship, I did not think the journey was a dangerous one. I left the ship because I thought I might as well be on the ice as on the vessel. I did not think I might die on the ice, but I thought I might die if I remained on board the vessel. At a later date, the captain and the first mate would state that on the morning of the 15th of May, the Stowaways left the ship without leave to walk to the shore. They argued that the ice was solid all the way to the land, which was demonstrably false, before insisting that they had no doubt that the boys would reach the shore unharmed. However, this contradicts with the previously stated intention of sending the boys to the Myrtle for a better chance of food. Regardless of how or why they left, the boys found themselves heading towards the Myrtle. They struggled over the broken ice fields and eventually lost their bearings. It was here that they reportedly spotted the distant haze of Newfoundland and decided to head for the shore instead of the other ship. According to one of the boys, they were still within sight of the Arran when they changed their course. Therefore, it seems that, at the very least, those on board did indeed let the boys go. Moreover, it was also reported that the captain was watching their progress through a telescope, the boys' slow and wary speckles vanishing into the vast white cracked plains of frozen ocean. The cracks in the ice widened and the boys were repeatedly forced to jump for their lives between the tufts of ice. Several times they fell into the icy water, and several times they clawed and scrambled their way out, repeatedly falling and wading through the North Atlantic. Took its toll on 2 of the younger boys, Hugh McGuinness and Hugh McEwen. At one point or another, each stowaway was submerged in the freezing waters. The older Brand found himself constantly looking back and doing what he could to help the other boys make the jumps between the platforms of ice. On the smooth-edged ice, they struggled, having to dig their fingernails into gain purchase to bring themselves up. I was thinking of home and doubting if I would ever reach it, and the houses of the streets were darkening for me as I tried to see the land through my tears. Before long, McEwen fell into the water for the final time, trapped by the ice closing above him. He and John Paul had been fatally coupled once more, blinded and beaten by the Arctic wind. They were slowly making progress to the land, not too far from the rest of the boys, when McEwen suddenly fell in. Struggling to stay afloat, he grabbed hold of John Paul, dragging the two of them down under the ice. John Paul managed to kick McEwen off, and then he turned and clawed once more at the seeping flow to pull himself to safety. When he eventually made it out of the water, he turned back around to help McEwen, but all he saw was the hair of his head shedding below the water, and I didn't see any more of him as he sank away below the ice. The remaining stowaways continued on, but shortly afterwards, Hugh McGuinness, his limbs swollen and feet lacerated, finally collapsed and sat down on the ice. He hopelessly declared that he could go no further. The other boys tried to rally him, for they could not carry him, though Brand had considered it. John Paul later recalled looking at beaten McGuinness's face, his eyes and lips swollen, skin blotched, but he was uncertain that McGuinness could see them. Brand asked him what was the matter, but he merely mumbled something in his throat. He neither spoke nor moved nor looked at us. The realisation came that it was futile. He could not be rallied. The shore was close for the other boys, and perhaps they noticed that their chances for survival were fleeting. They did not wish to think about making their way across the hazardous sheets of ice when the sun had gone. The sun had shown them some mercy that morning and stopped them from freezing, but by the early afternoon it was melting the thin ice, making the boys' journey that much more perilous. They had already witnessed McEwen vanish beneath the ice, and as far as they were concerned, another step was impossible for the 12-year-old McGuinness. All that could be done was to hope that they would make it, find help, and somehow manage to come back for him. So the boys walked on with heavy hearts and weary minds, and Hugh McGuinness died there alone on the ice, his cries following them for miles. We could not carry him, and he could not walk. The last I saw of him, he was sitting on the ice and crying. I'll never forget that awful look in his face till the day of my death. We never seen him more. We was real sorry that we didn't cut a button off his jacket or his vest to bring him to his poor mother at Greenock. Just something that would have been a keepsake of him. If she had only seen him as we had saw him lying there, so helpless, with nobody near him, with no soul to speak to him, nor watch him till he died. John Paul admitted later in his testimony that he was afraid to look back or to watch McGuinness, but noticed that Brand looked back 2 or 3 times, tears freezing on his face. Brand is a real good, hearty chap. He's bound to get a good place somewhere. The remaining stowaways eventually reached the edge of the ice where a mile-long channel of unfrozen water lay between them and the coast of Newfoundland. With no way of reaching the other side, the boys bawled out when they noticed the shapes of houses on the land. Certain that they would die if they attempted to swim, Brand set out on a separate piece of ice and attempted to paddle to the shore with a piece of wood. Fortunately, a woman who was walking along the shoreline spotted the boys. Perhaps she heard their distant yells, and soon after a boat was sent out to their rescue. The rescuers sped out to them, hammering and smashing the ice in order to carve a path to the stowaways. Blinded by the snow and shivering from the cold, the exhausted survivors were pulled aboard by the folk from the village who worked tirelessly to reach them. As the sun set on the long and treacherous journey, the boys were taken to safety and warmth in the Bay of St. George on the coast of Newfoundland. After a time spent with their rescuers and recovering from their injuries and ordeal, the boys were put up in the Albert Hotel. We got everything we could want in the hotel, plenty of nice meat and nice beds. We were spoken to like gentlemen, and I only wish I could have stayed at that hotel my whole life. All my life. Some of them got work at the opposite side of the bay. Bryson went into fishing and farming at Sandy Point. I liked the place, and only came home when sent for by a government. Pardon me. I liked the place and only came home when sent for by the government for sending me. I was happy and preferred it in Greenock. And I was happy and I preferred it to Greenock. I didn't want to go home. 30th of July 1868. Meanwhile, by the end of July, the Arran had returned to Greenock. Ahead of her was a letter from a crew member to his family back home, which recounted the atrocities which had been committed during the journey. Word spread quickly in the town, and on the evening of the 30th of July, a hostile crowd awaited the Arran at Albert Point. For anybody who's not from Scotland, you don't want a hostile crowd for Greenock waiting on you when you're arriving home. Upon seeing Captain Watt and First Mate James Kerr, the hissing mob erupted into angry outburst. Several members of the public reportedly jumped aboard the ship, seeking vigilante justice, while the captain and his first mate hid in their cabins until the police arrived. After several hours, the police escorted the crew off the ship to the Sheriff Courthouse, all the while the mob pelting the cab with whatever they could throw. Following preliminary investigations, both the captain and the mate were detained until the trial in a few months' time. The 23rd of November 1868. On Monday the 23rd of November, the trial of Robert Watt and James Kerr began at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh. Despite the testimonies of the Stowaways presented during the trial and the overwhelming evidence of mistreatment from the prosecution, including several retellings of how the two Hughes were perished alone out on the ice fields, there were still those who spoke to the character of Captain Robert Watt. The defence also argued that the treatment of the boys was suitable to their actions and behaviour on board the ship. A member of the crew, Robert Hunter, was called up to the defence saying, "I have never sailed with this captain before. He is a good captain and kind to his crew." At first, the Stowaways said they were all fed, but afterwards they told the reverse. "I have seen Bryson stealing food repeatedly." The boys, they state, had not been ill-treated, but had been treated kindly, the mate adding that he could not have behaved better to his own family. The captain and first mate were found guilty of culpable homicide, but received minimal sentences. They were sentenced to 18 and 4 months imprisonment, respectively. That's the story of the tale of the Seven Stowaways. I'm going to end this video here and I'll make another video with another story of this later on. Hope you enjoyed. Bye bye.